When I was a little girl, I wanted to be a race car driver. I still drive like that too. And for a very short minute, I wanted to be a model, and you can see by the picture why that didn't last very long. And then I wanted to be a writer, which is what I am today. But all of these dreams were put on hold while I dealt with the impact of a traumatic childhood. When I was 7 years old, my father kidnapped me. He came to my mother's home and picked me up for Easter vacation, flew me to Boston, drove me to Canada, and then took me out of the country for 3.5 years. During that time, I was moved from place to place to place in an effort to hide me from authorities. My father was also an abusive man, very violent. I was exposed to things no child should ever have to endure during that time. His family also psychologically tortured my mother, lying to her about where I was, manipulating her in an effort to break her spirit. But if you knew my mother, it didn't work. She didn't give up. On my 11th birthday, the US Embassy in London called the district attorney's office in my hometown and informed them I was, in fact, living in the country. I flew home, a milk carton kid found, on Independence Day, 1982. Yay. Later in my life, the impact of these experiences would lead me to addiction and homelessness. During the years leading up to that night 16 years ago, I experienced what some people refer to as a dark night of the soul. I failed as a mother, as a daughter, a sister, and a friend. Today, I have an absolutely beautiful life, and I have big dreams. So go back to your vision of that ideal future, and keep it in mind as we talk about the process of turning pain into power, because that's what it's all about. So the trauma of my childhood and the mistakes I made as an adult actually taught me the first lesson that I needed to know to turn my pain into power. You see, I spent most of my life trying to avoid the pain that I felt as a result of my experience, only to discover I was avoiding the very thing that would bring me strength. In order to leverage our pain, we have to feel it. So pain is defined as an unpleasant sensory or emotional experience. Physical pain sometimes leaves a scar. A burn teaches us to avoid boiling water. Losing an arm to a tiger teaches us to avoid tigers, right? Hopefully. Emotional pain serves exactly the same purpose, to help us learn lessons about how to function in the world. Sadness at the loss of love teaches us the importance and value of love in our lives. Regret teaches us to behave differently. Anger, in the face of injustice, compels us to take action. So with this understanding that all pain is universal, all pain is natural, it's a part of the human experience, it begs the question why we have such a hard time with emotional pain. Shame and resentment are like taking the tiger that took your arm, putting him in your backpack, and then walking around with him for 20 years. That's exactly what those things are like, right? Why do we do that? Why is it that we, instead of processing the pain that we feel, we hold on to it like a glorious treasure? Well, I believe there are a number of interrelated factors that contribute to this. Over the last 300 years, since the Age of Enlightenment, philosophers, scientists, economists have largely focused on the role of the mind or rational cognitive phenomena to explain human behavior. This has been very powerful and important for the advancement of technology, the understanding of how the human body works, health, and technological development. But it's also limited us in some ways because we lost the foundation of understanding that the mystics and ancient philosophers understood. And that is, we can't solve the world's biggest problems by only looking at part of the human experience. The emotional experience is as important to developing understanding as the body and the mind. Compassion, empathy, pain, all of these things are as important as the mind. Another contributing factor is the way many of us were raised. I don't know about you, but for the most part, my mom's philosophy was get over it. Right? Very deep. Don't get me wrong, I love my mom, but she wasn't much of a nurturer. So we were taught to get over it. And this is really effective at teaching us how to act right. It's a sociological mechanism, right? And it's also a rational mechanism. We want the people around us in society to act right. But it doesn't give us the tools that we need to learn how to process the deep sadness and the anger that we feel when we're young. Now, this is important too because the way we process emotions changes with age throughout development. If, let's say you're 4 or 5 years old and your parents get divorced. That, at that age, could very well be an existential crisis because it causes you to question everything you've ever known. And at 4 or 5 years old, you don't have any other tools than this, and that is to make a decision about what life is like and how to avoid that happening again. And that is a perfectly normal response for a 4 or 5-year-old. You blame your mother, you don't trust women. You blame your dad, you don't trust men. Okay, life just got simpler, right? Well, we can't continue to process our emotions like that throughout our entire lives. Or we can try, but at some point it will become a problem, I can almost guarantee you. I have a funny story. So I dated a man some years ago who hated all sorts of food. He didn't like salmon, he didn't like tomatoes or mayonnaise or onions, the list was really long. But I noticed something interesting. If he didn't know he was eating some of those foods, he seemed to like them just fine. So with a little poking and prodding for me, it turns out he had made a decision early in his life because he had a dysfunctional relationship with food in his primary family unit about what he liked and he didn't like, and he never thought about it again. And that's a funny example, but it's an example of how when we make decisions and we don't go back and look at them again, we essentially make our world smaller and smaller and smaller. And you can't live a powerful life in a tiny box. Pain doesn't mean something is necessarily wrong. This is really an opportunity to see the experience of pain differently. What it is a chance to learn something new about life, to learn something new about yourself and the experience of being human. The second key to turning pain into power is to challenge the story you have about your life. We all have a story, and usually some sub-stories in certain areas, whether that be finances or relationships. So, have you ever sat down to dinner with family and friends, old friends, and said something like this? Hey, do you remember that time that Johnny caught that rabbit in 3rd grade? It was so funny. And your mom says, that wasn't Johnny, that was Sarah. And you're like, oh, she's crazy. How can her memory be so different than what actually happened? Well, it turns out it isn't just her memory. We used to believe that the eyes functioned like video recorders, objectively taking in all of the information around us, and that the brain worked as a replay mechanism, recounting objectively what happened on demand. But we now know that neither of those functions works that way. We are not, in any capacity, whether it be through input or recall, objective. According to the Innocence Project, 75% of convictions overturned by DNA evidence involved faulty eyewitness testimony. 75%. All of this is really helpful in helping us recognize a powerful distinction. What happened is not the same as the story as you have about it. We know this because these two things have distinct characteristics. What happened in the past, by definition, right? When is the story happening? Right now. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be the story anymore. It would be a different story, which it probably will be tomorrow. What happened is objective, although technically not knowable, for the reasons we just discussed, right? Something did happen, and that is the truth. But everything we know about it is subjectively obtained. The story is subjective, and most of us know it like we know our ABCs. Now, I don't want you to hear this and think that what I'm saying is that your memories don't matter or that they're wrong. That is not the point here at all. In fact, that's a common control mechanism that perpetrators use. Your story matters, and so does everybody else's. We don't get to say what happened for another human being. But the story isn't false. Just like me saying I like the color red isn't false, right? But that doesn't make it an external objective reality. And that's where the power is in this distinction, right? Because if the story that you have about your life, which is where all your beliefs are formed, where the meaning is made, is not an objective external reality, if it's happening in the present moment, that means you can influence it. Now, I'm not encouraging you to make things up either. That would just make you crazy, right? The point of this key is to create space for finding meaning and finding beliefs that empower you, that create peace for you. It's in recognizing that the story that you have about your life is not the master. It's not an external reality. You get to choose. Does that make sense? So there is a lot of evidence to support this. That's the big fish story. Research into cognitive bias, of which there are many, a nice long list. You can go to Wikipedia and look up cognitive biases, and it's a very long list. I was going to count it, but I didn't. One example of it, so cognitive biases are the human tendency of our mind to play tricks on us, okay? And in predictable and subconscious ways. So we don't know it's happening for the most part. Cognitive confirmation bias is the tendency to recall information that confirms the story we have about what happened. Freud himself said that memories are constructions of actual events and fantasies and subsequent events and fantasies. So if you wrote a paper in 9th grade and you got a C on it, and that was a disappointment, I would have been thrilled. But let's say you got a C on it and you were disappointed, or an F. At the time, with the tools that you had, you may have made a decision that went something like, I'm not a good writer, or I'm not a good communicator. The belief that formed in that moment could be any number of things. With this exploration, you have the power to go back and to recognize that maybe you were just having a bad day, or maybe even your teacher was just having a bad day, right? The possibilities for what happened, because what happened is objective, external, and not knowable, the possibilities increase to the point where we become free to live in the comfort of the not knowing. So that's why I'm not saying make things up, because creating another option isn't any more helpful necessarily, right? I'm just saying maybe let go of the knowing a little bit. And in that, you'll find a lot of peace and a great deal of power. Getting in touch with our pain our humanity, is the first key to turning pain into power. Then we explore the story we have about what we think life is like and who we are. We examine our beliefs and the meaning we have made about the things that have happened. These two keys alone will change your life forever. And some people will stop here because they'll tell themselves that the last key doesn't apply to them, or that it just seems daunting. Well, the difference between living a powerful life and living a happy and empowered life is forgiveness. After examining this story, you're likely to recognize or to realize that there are parts of it where you feel powerless. No part of you wants it to be the way it was. A loved one dies, somebody unexpectedly breaks your heart, you lie or cheat in a moment of weakness, something unfair or unjust happens. I lived the first 35 years of my life absolutely furious at my mother for the things that happened in my childhood. In fact, it was much more difficult to forgive her than to forgive my father. But I also felt helpless because of the things that my father did. I felt like I didn't have a right to choose what happened to my body. When I began to mourn my past and forgive everyone who had ever caused harm in my life, including myself, everything in my life changed. And that's not an overstatement. Literally everything in my life changed. Forgiveness is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts out there. There are a lot of false ideas about what it is and what it isn't. In the simplest of terms, forgiveness is a choice to not suffer. It is changing the relationship that you have to your experiences in such a way as to create the opportunity for gratitude for the very things you once thought you could never forgive. People ask me sometimes, how can you be grateful for your experiences? How can you be grateful for being kidnapped and being sold into slavery? And the answer to the question is very, very simple. I wouldn't be me without them. And that is what forgiveness is all about. It's about finding compassion and affinity for the person you are today. Now, that doesn't mean I wouldn't change things. Believe me, if you knew me well, you would see a nice long list of things that I would like to change, right? But what we come to recognize is that you can't create change unless you're standing on the truth. You have to start with acceptance and a sense of value of the self in order to create lasting and authentic change. You can't ridicule yourself into being a different person. You have to love yourself into that. And that acceptance, that is forgiveness, is the first part of that. In my book, I define forgiveness as a process of self-actualization, which is what we're talking about today, in which we choose to move through hurt feelings such as shame, anger, and resentment in favor of or in exchange for self-love, self-compassion, and empathy for other people. Let's break that down just a little bit. It's a process. The gesture, I forgive you, is nice, but it's really not about forgiveness at all. It's about trust. It's about relationship. And that's one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about forgiveness. The other person has nothing to do with the process. It's 100% internal, just like grief. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no value in extending gestures between people, but people get bogged down in thinking that forgiveness is things that it's not. If somebody has caused you harm and they haven't changed their ways, my encouragement is forgive them completely, but don't trust them, right? That doesn't make sense. So we've talked about the first part of the process, which is getting present to the pain. And then we challenge the story that we have about our lives. The second part of it is the increase in an experience of love and compassion and empathy. And that is required. You know, we want to be indifferently forgiving. And that just doesn't work. To be human is to love deeply, to be vulnerable, and to sometimes feel pain. If you want to be powerful, you have to become as deeply present to that truth and that reality as possible. Tony Robbins just popped into my mind. Actually, so did Brene Brown. Because they're emotional people, right? And for me, they're good examples of powerful. You might not be a huge fan, but they're powerful people. They're the best at what they do, right? And they're not rigid. They're not stoic. They're deeply in touch with the emotional aspects of their experience. And my guess is they're also both very forgiving people. There are three main reasons people don't forgive. Either they don't understand the process, they don't know what forgiveness is, or they get something out of not forgiving. The last one is really always true. The most common things that we get out of not forgiving are self-righteousness and indignation. And we live in an epidemic of those in the world today. Many people, because they don't understand the true power of forgiveness, choose being right over moving on, over taking the tiger out of their backpack. So within the category of not understanding what forgiveness is, the most common, probably one of the most common things I hear is, I'm not going to forgive that person because I'll be letting them off the hook. They should be accountable for what they've done. And yeah, they should be accountable for what they've done, but it's got nothing to do with your forgiveness. In fact, our impulse to hold people accountable, including ourselves, increases when we become more forgiving because we take less shit from people. It really is that simple. When you value yourself and you value other human beings, you get really clear on what works and what doesn't work. So this idea that it's somehow letting someone off the hook is just a fundamental misunderstanding about what forgiveness is. Some of you in the audience thinking, that's really interesting, but it doesn't apply to me. I have never been kidnapped. I love my parents. I had an amazing childhood. Yes, my heart's been broken a few times, but whatever, I get it. That's just the way life is. Well, forgiveness applies to everybody. And one of the reasons for that is one of the things we talked about earlier, and that is when we're young, or really at any point in life until we develop a high emotional IQ, instead of processing the pain that we feel, we store it in our bodies. We put the tiger in our backpack and we keep it with us, right? And then within that, we start forming beliefs. So that's the coping mechanism that we use in order to avoid processing the pain. Forgiveness is the mechanism that you use to begin to unravel that rigid worldview structure that you have. So you make a decision, I can't trust women. Okay, that's at 5 because your mom cheated on your dad. And then a few years later, you make a decision, okay, well, I don't like salmon for sure because my mom just yelled at my dad at dinner and it was really embarrassing. And, and we go through life and we make decisions. I don't like this type of person and I don't like that kind of person and this doesn't work for me and that doesn't work for me. And our world gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, forgiveness is the exact mechanism that you can use to let that rigid structure go. We forgive the things that we perceive to have been wrong. All forgiveness begins with essentially the same judgment, and that judgment is there's something wrong. In the absence of that, the need for forgiveness goes away. Does that make sense? So in order to make forgiveness more accessible, a lot of people sometimes think, yeah, I can forgive this person and this person and this person, but not that person. Child abuse, no. She may have forgiven her father, but I never would, right? When we realize that what other people do is not about us, the resistance to not forgiving certain people goes away. Let's say you're walking down the street and there's a guy 20 feet in front of you with the underwear on the outside of his pants. And he's got two different types of shoes on, okay? And you're like, that goes a little strange. And you're walking by and he stomps on your toe. In that moment, you definitely think this guy's crazy, but you probably don't think, I need to forgive him. Why is that? He just hurt you. If the need for forgiveness began when somebody caused harm, that would apply, but it doesn't. It doesn't apply because you don't take it personally, because you know it's not about you. Imagine for a minute that that is always true. Imagine for a minute that hurt people, that when we do things that cause harm in the world, we're doing that out of our own pain. I didn't become a drug addict because I didn't love my son. I did it because it was the only way I knew to manage the pain that I felt. When we can really embody this idea, not to take things personally, the need for forgiveness becomes much simpler. It doesn't completely go away because sometimes we get emotionally injured in close relationships, but it gets easier. It gets much, much easier. We know we've forgiven when the first thought we have about the other person is compassionate. People ask me that all the time. How do I know if I've forgiven somebody? Well, you have kind thoughts about them. You don't wish them ill will. I have the same love and compassion for the men who tried to sell me 16 years ago as I do for my son. There's no difference in the experience of extending my common humanity to one person over another, because I don't fear them. I don't want to speak to them, right? I'm not in relationship with them. That's a different thing. So we have compassion for the people and emotional neutrality around the experience. So you can talk about it and it doesn't upset you. That's how you know when you've forgiven. This process is about falling in love with our scars and taking a stand for creating a beautiful future. To be the most empowered version of you, you have to wake up in the morning, see the scars that life has left, and say thank you with a full and grateful heart. With gratitude for our scars comes the power to create so much more to be grateful for. To be willing to do that, spend time every day doing something you absolutely love. Spend time connecting with other human beings. Forgive everyone. If they've caused you harm, wish them well from a distance. There is no risk in wishing someone peace, and it will change your heart for the better. Stand up for what you believe in. There's no easier way to fall in love with ourselves and our scars than to be a person you're proud to be. Living a powerful life is not about luck or genius. It's about being fully grounded in the truth. Our power does not come from force or from effort. It comes from our pain. So I'd like to ask you one more time to go back to that question. Do you believe it's possible to turn your pain into power? Thank you. We have 10 minutes? I think we have 10 more minutes, so we've got time for questions. Yes?
You said that there were 3 reasons not to understand what forgiveness is, and the first one was indignation. What are the other 2?
There are 3 reasons people don't forgive. The first one is that they don't understand what forgiveness is, they don't know how to do it, or they get something out of not forgiving. We've got plenty of time for questions. Yes? Compassion in this context, I think a poetic way to see compassion is love in action. So it's the experience, right? So you can define that in two ways. Experientially, right? It feels like love, but it also has a component of taking action and standing up for that love in a way that is a reflection of an understanding of connection and common humanity.
You said there's power in insecurity, right? Or power in uncertainty.
Yeah.
Because if you challenge a story, that's not set in stone, that you can find power in that. I've done it before, and it's led to insecurity, actually.
Yeah.
More questions and more, I don't know everything type feeling.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I get that. So we spend most of our lives in a dualistic experience we learn, almost everything we learn is right and wrong. This is the power of art and music, by the way. And when we are asked to explore the paradox of the not knowing of the experience of our lives, it can feel absolutely terrifying. It can feel like you're standing on the edge of a cliff, and that is a valid experience. My encouragement for anybody that has that experience is to stay present to it, because that's right before a higher meaning emerges. So the fear in that context is really a guide that you're headed in the right direction. Yes, it's disorienting to stand in a little bit of a paradox for that tool, right, of the not knowing. But the discomfort is not a red flag in this situation. It's really, it's telling you you're headed in the right direction. And it's also why I say wait for meaning to emerge, because when we try to take meaning, we say, no, that's not right, I'm definitely not a bad communicator, I'm a good communicator. Then we're like, no, wait, maybe I'm not a good communicator, I don't know, right? So we wait, we let go of the structure of the knowing, we experience ourselves in life, and the meaning and the knowing emerges naturally. Does that make sense? Yes?
In your experience, is it ever too early to begin?
I do believe there's a time, and I wish that the answer was it's always spontaneously possible, but I actually don't believe that to be true. I think there's a time and a place, and as individuals, we know when that is. I think as practitioners, it's our job to make sure that they're clear on what it is and what it isn't. And the first two keys that we talked about today are powerful in breaking that apart a little bit. So in my book, I talk about 5 skills we need to become forgiving. So rather than talking about forgiveness as this is what you need to do, talk about the other skills. And then when they get to that place of being ready for forgiveness, they'll have the skills they need to move through the process. And one of those skills is feeling the pain. Another one is understanding the relationship we have to our story. Empathy for other people and non-judgment is the 4th one.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes?
How do you unconditionally forgive people without becoming a doormat? And the second part of that question is, if you don't stand up for yourself, or you continue to let them behave the way that they are, how do you get them to improve?
Good luck with that. I don't know anything about making other people improve, but so forgiveness in an active relationship is the most challenging context to do it. Are you talking about an active relationship?
Well, many different kinds of relationships.
Yeah.
Like colleagues, social, interpersonal, just everything.
Yeah.
I don't want to reinforce bad behavior, for example.
Yeah, well, true forgiveness won't facilitate reinforcing bad behavior because, forgiveness is about finding peace and recognizing that what they do is not about you, right? And simultaneously to that, because you're developing a higher sense of self-respect and self-love and affinity for the self, you do the difficult job of communicating. That doesn't work for me, right? Those are separate. The forgiveness is a good prerequisite for creating boundaries. And the reason for that is because then you can create them with compassion. We can all create boundaries by being a jerk, right? But if you've started with forgiveness and recognizing that what other people do is not about you, then you can set boundaries that are firm and clear and specific, but do it with compassion and clarity. So, in the absence of doing both of those things, the risk of appearing to be a doormat does go up. It does, right? You know, people think that people who are kind and patient and loving are, and I don't like the word doormat, but, you know, that they're easier to get one over on, right? But try that on me, right? There are some people that know me in the room. I'm not going to take shit from anybody, right? But the processes had to work together. I had to learn, okay, how do I actually show up in the world as somebody that respects and loves herself? I had to learn that after I went through the forgiveness process, because I didn't want to be a jerk either, although sometimes I still am. But does that answer both of your questions? Okay.
Especially with deep personal relationships where the person has been hurt. How long will this pain last? I tell them you work through it. I give them tools to work through it. I've done that myself, but I don't know what to tell them.
Well, I don't think we can really answer that for another person, but I'll tell you this, if they detach from the story, it won't take nearly as long, right? And if they learn to process the emotions. I mean, I've seen revolutionary change in people in weeks, and I'm not even exaggerating. It happens all the time. People let go of a story that they have and they let themselves mourn the experience deeply. Boom, 3 or 4 experiences like that, and they're free from that. Sometimes it comes up again a little bit later, but they know how to process it. So, yes?
Sorry. How do you experience the pain without it overwhelming you?
That's a great question. Did everybody hear it? How do you experience the pain without letting it overwhelming you? And the answer to that question is by not judging it. You separate the emotional and the mental experience. So, oh my God, I feel so sad. You know, I need a minute. You take the minute, and then you just feel it. You let the tears come, and you let the body shake, and it comes and it goes. You don't make a story about it. It doesn't matter if it's the millionth time it's happened. You let it come and you let it go. It usually, almost always takes 10 minutes in the absence of a story, in the absence of a narrative. That narrative is judgment. I shouldn't be feeling this way. Why do I still feel this way? I can't believe this is still happening. I'm so weak. I'm so stupid. That's what causes us to unravel, is the mental activity. Yes?
Do you have any advice for personalities who tend to absorb the pain of others as well as their own?
Embrace it. That's my advice. I'm that way too, and what I've come to realize is that's a profound gift for me. Maybe in the sharing of the pain, it eases it a little bit for them, and that's something I'm willing to do. And in fact, when the sadness comes and goes, I feel grateful. I feel happy for it. That's my advice. Yes? Did you still have a question?
I did. Is there ever a time and a place for anger?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan. Yes, anger is a natural human emotion.
In a good way, like using anger for good. I often feel like anger is given a bad
It is.
reputation, but
Yeah.
and like I just think that some of the way that we as people who talk about this conversation a lot, feels like we neutralize our emotions so that we just often just let them go, but sometimes anger can be actually really a force for good.
It absolutely can be a force for good. And I encourage people to come up with healthy ways to manage it. And in that, they gain a higher capacity to see what's behind it. Kickboxing, for example, running. No, I'm serious. Some sort of physical activity, because it's a physical emotion. What else? All right. Well, I hope to see you down the hall, 10C, for the book signing. It's in 30 minutes. Take care.